morning and welcome again. This is the exciting bit, the first bit. You know, you come to the more serious bit later. Anyway, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Janice Thompson. Those of you who came to the EGM will remember seeing her there. She is a leading expert in the field of public health, nutrition and exercise, so there will be exercises at the end. And their role in preventing and treating risks for obesity, cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes across the lifespan. So we very much look forward to hearing you, Janice. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor to be invited to present to you today. It's a great turnout. I don't have any formal organized physical activities set up for you, but I will talk a bit today about getting up and breaking up our sitting and sedentary time. So at any time you want to get up, stand up, you can do it. You know, that's completely up to you. So there's no rule that you have to sit in your seat, and I think you'll learn a little bit more today about how I'm encouraging us to do that less and less in terms of sitting in our seats. So you can see the title of my talk. I decided to make it a little bit of an equation. Moving plus eating well equals aging well. So I'm going to talk about a number of things today. And we'll have time for questions and answers, not only at the end, but I'm going to stay up to lunch. I'm going to be leaving at about 1:30 today. So if we don't get to all the Q&A at the session, I'm happy to have a chat, you know, during lunch or something, or during the break. So one of the topics I'm going to talk about is how active should we be to support healthy aging? I get that question a lot. Just how much do we have to do? What should we be doing? What is a healthy diet? Get that question a lot too. What types of food should we be eating to support healthy aging? And then there's a questionnaire that I think you've gotten access to or you've been given it's called the UK Diabetes and Diet Questionnaire. I'll talk a little bit about that today. It's something myself and one of my PhD students, who's now Dr. Claire England, have developed. And I'll talk a little bit about why that questionnaire might be useful, even if you don't have diabetes or you feel you're not at risk. So, just a brief overview of what's considered the classic trajectory of us getting older and our physical function. So you can see on the left-hand y-axis is your functional capacity, or our functional capacity as human beings. And you can see across the lifespan, when we're young and in early life, our function keeps getting, higher, we're getting stronger, we're growing. We get into adult life, it tends to flatten out a bit. But then of course, in middle age and a bit older, it starts to decline. Now that's considered sort of the classic trajectory. You'll see the blue line is, in a sense, where we hope people can be. But the yellow line, or orange line, is what happens quite frequently, where our ability to be highly physically functional starts to decline quite a bit, depending upon our health and other sorts of events that may happen in our lives. So what we're trying to do is keep that gap to a minimum. We'd like to be living as high a quality of life and as high of a functional life, physically and cognitively, mentally, for as long as we're alive. That's really the goal. And so what can we do to achieve that? Well, there's lots of things, but both diet or nutrition and physical activity do play really key roles in trying to keep our trajectory as optimal as possible. And you can see that gap I highlight with the circle. We're trying to close that gap and keep it to the blue line, or even making the blue line maybe not so steep and a little bit flatter. Now this is an example. This shows, it's an old study, but I like to show it because this is a bunch of guys who are exercise physiologists, men, and they, kept getting older, and they're in academia, and this is the old days when, they didn't have much to do but test themselves on the treadmill and each other. So that's what they did for a long time. They taught their classes and they did some research, and then every year they did these, what they call VO2 max tests. So they tested their maximum oxygen capacity, their ability to be aerobically functional, and they did it pretty much every year over 33 years. And these were people that were able to retain and maintain activity levels. Now, and maybe they weren't as strong or as fast as they were when they were younger, of course not, but they looked at their actual aerobic fitness, and you can see that that trajectory is really different from the line I just showed you. But these are people that have been able to sustain regular, fairly moderate to intense activity throughout their lives. So that, in a sense, is what it can do for us if we can sustain it, but we don't have to just sustain really high levels to get the benefit, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So what is recommended? What is enough? Well, a lot of the evidence and, of course, the recommendations, let me go through those with you so we're all on the same page. You've probably heard that we should do about 30 minutes a day, or about 150 minutes total for the week, of what we call moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. So it's activities that can get you breathing a bit harder. You can maybe still talk while you're doing them, but get you breathing a little bit harder, get you sweating a bit. Those are the sorts of things that we should be doing. But we don't have to do them for 30 minutes at a time. We used to think you had to do them in 10-minute chunks so they didn't count. Not true. We're now finding that any bits of time that you can string together throughout the day make a difference and is important for your health. So you don't have to be rigid to say, I've got to do at least 30 minutes in a row or I've failed, so I'm just not going to do anything. And that's what a lot of people do. I can't do my 30 today, just not going to do it. I'd say get off your and go and do your 5, or 3, or whatever it happens to be. Now, the other thing that's been added to this, because particularly as we age, it's important, is trying to do at least 2 days a week of strengthening type of exercises for our muscles. So you don't have to necessarily go to a gym, but any sort of strengthening exercises. It could be exercise classes where you're doing some forms of strengthening exercises. It could be bands. It could be weights if you like weights. There can be even some a lot of things you can do at home. Even strenuous gardening if you're doing heavy lifting and things like that would be a strengthening exercise. So we should do that because one of the things we lose the most as we get older is muscle strength. And particularly for women, by the time women are in their 50s, most women aren't able to lift 10 pounds of weight over their head. They're not strong enough to do that. So that's not very old. I'm 56, so to me 50 and above is young. And the fact that women can't lift just a bit of weight over their head also means they can't get themselves out of trouble when they have it, or if they fall, it's hard to lift themselves up. So there's no reason why we should be losing the upper body strength. It's simply because we're not using our upper bodies. Now, the caveat is, particularly as we get older, for people who can't achieve that recommendation, it's to be as active as you can be for the condition that you are in your life. So if you have an illness or you have a disability, you have a condition that modifies how much you can do, maybe you can't always meet the guidelines, that's okay. So it isn't an either or an all or nothing. And I think that's the really important message. People get frustrated because they say, I'm not listening to the guidelines, they're completely unrealistic, and I'm not going to do them. Or some people are more active and they poo-poo them saying, oh, unless you do what I do, because I'm super, super fit, and you are, then it's not good enough. And that's not true. So the message really is anything you can do is better than nothing. So I'll show you some data that supports that. This was a large study that looked at physical activity levels and mortality risk in older adults. They used the term elderly, which I don't use, but that's from the study, so it's there. I try to be true to the science. So it was over 3,000 men and women, 65 years and older. What does this show us? This shows us the risk of early mortality. We know we all eventually die. So, none of us is at no risk for mortality, but it's whether we consider it relatively premature for the average life expectancy of a given population. So here, people that did no physical activity were what we called the comparator group. So they're given a number of 1. So just think of them as sort of the baseline comparator. So if you look at that, a mortality risk, and that's what we call hazard ratio. So if you were living longer than somebody who did no exercise, what would you expect that mortality risk number to be, higher or lower? Lower, that's right, because that 1 is the people that do nothing. So as you can see in the graph, they actually have the highest risk of premature mortality. So the people doing occasional, that's not even once a week, because the once a week it goes even lower, which means it's even more of an improvement. 2 times a week was really considered sort of the at least optimal to get some of that benefit to reduce the risk for premature mortality. And if you can see that, their risk was reduced by about 40%. So 2 times a week doesn't even meet the guidelines, but it shows you the message I said earlier. Going from doing nothing to doing something is the most effective thing to do. And if you can do more, great. You still get some added benefit, but you don't have to do the maximum to get the benefit. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So what's some new evidence that we're now starting to look at? We've been really hung up, really caught up into the moderate to vigorous physical intensity, physical activity world for a long time, because the evidence for a long time was indicating to us that you had to do at least moderate intensity activity or you weren't getting the benefits, the health benefits. But actually now we're seeing that that's not the case. We've got better measurement tools. So in the past, what we were using was quite crude or it was self-reported, and it didn't really help us tease out different levels of intensity. We've now got better technology. Some of you might have been in studies or worn them yourselves. Not so much the pedometers or the step counts, but they're things called accelerometers. They're almost like a black box. They don't give you any numbers, but we get to see what's inside of them, and they're quite sophisticated, and they measure your movement in 3 different planes. They're quite useful. These have now shown us that light intensity physical activity does have health promoting benefits. So that helps to add to that message even further. Even if you can't meet the recommendations for moderate to vigorous, we know that light physical activity does have a benefit. So again, it's really good to go from doing nothing to even doing light activities if you're not able to, or you might intersperse light, moderate types of activities. Also, there's an importance of doing what we call multi-component activities or programs. So they would be things that would combine activities that help us strengthen our balance, improve our overall muscle strength, our endurance, gait, so our ability to walk, and a range of physical function activities. And also includes recreational and social activities. So the programs that have this multi-component approach have actually been shown to be the most beneficial, particularly as we get older. So that's where I think your organization and a lot of the things you promote and you do are feeding directly into the new evidence that's now showing us this is exactly the kinds of things we want to be promoting and doing, engaging in as we get older, because those are the sorts of things that are going to help us optimize our health, our function. Yeah? Now, it may be a no-brainer to you, but as scientists, it takes us a while to get there because we're quite cynical by nature and we don't believe anything until it's shown to us through various sorts of technology. So maybe to you this doesn't seem like a big deal, but in our world of exercise and research, it's a huge deal to now value and recognize light activity. And it's also really important that we can appreciate these multi-component programs because they've finally been studied enough in a rigorous way. Lots of programs are out there, but very few of them have been evaluated to make scientists feel comfortable that they're telling us the real story. So that's why it might seem like we're a little bit delayed over what people in the general community say, we already know that, but we need to sort of test it in a sense. I hate to use the word prove because prove's so strong it makes it sound like it's not questionable anymore. That's never the case, but it does give us confidence in these sorts of activities now. And then, as I mentioned before, with encouraging people to stand up when you need or move around, is this need to reduce and break up our sedentary time. We're sitting 8 to 12 hours a day, every day. And that's even people who are working. And if you think, for those people, let's say you sleep 8 hours a day, not all people do, but if you add that up, that's very, very little time when you're not supine or sitting, and that's problematic for our health. So what is it about sedentary time? It's really, most activities we would do that would be sedentary would be predominantly sitting, watching television or other sorts of things. How we define that is it's a resting level of energy expenditure. So 1 MET, M-E-T, it's a metabolic equivalent number. 1 MET is equivalent to how much energy we expend, how much oxygen we use when we sit at rest. So sedentary time or sedentary behavior we define, and we can actually measure how much energy it expends. It's not very much. It's resting or just slightly above. Now, there's a lot of studies and a lot of evidence that shows this very strong association between being sedentary and, again, premature mortality from all causes, but also specifically from cardiovascular disease. And this is independent, so it's separate from the amount of physical activity and exercise we do. So they're actually two different concepts, in a sense. We might think of them all along the same line, because in a way they're sort of on a continuum. But in terms of our health and our body, it looks like the body might respond a little bit differently. So if you're more sedentary, you have greater risk for obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. But you can be physically active and sedentary. So don't be smug when you do your hour of exercise and you go home and you sit for 9 hours. You can be smug. I mean, maybe that's just your way. But don't think you're better than everybody else, because what you should be doing is doing that hour of exercise, going home, or wherever you're going to be sedentary, and then every time you're sedentary, get up. At least a couple times an hour. Make that cup of tea. Use the loo. Wander around. Do something where you're moving a bit. You don't have to be doing formal exercises. Even just walking or taking a few flights of stairs is breaking up sedentary time. So that's what we're looking for people to do. And we know that when people do that, the research shows that even just really brief bouts of breaking up can help moderate the negative effects we get from sitting for too long. And this is a kind of a combination of a lot of different studies that were put together in a graph. And this just illustrates our risk for type 2 diabetes. So on the left, basically, these are studies where people did, what does it say there? It's, there we go. Percent risk reduction were associated. So these were the people that met the minimum of the activity guideline, say for walking. So if people did that, they decreased their risk for type 2 diabetes anywhere from about 10% to about 45%. And then if you look at more on the sedentary side, these were studies that looked at people who watched at least 2 hours of TV a day. And you can see that they increased risk for diabetes when they did that by about 20% on average, but it ranged from about 20 to 40%. So there's the benefits to doing, this in this case, the walking and meeting those guidelines for the walking, but there was also some detriments, as you can see, with the sitting time. And normally, it's easier to measure people when they sit and watch television. We have a lot of good tools for that. There's arguments that sitting and reading might be different. It's definitely different cognitively. It's beneficial sitting and playing games. But remember, you're moving a bit when you do some of those things. Reading, maybe not so much. But I would never tell people to stop reading. No, ever. No, we wouldn't do that. So it's okay. Sit and read. You have my permission. And so they've developed this. This is a colleague of mine in the U.S., and they've developed a graphic here you can see for the overall message, kind of combining things. Because we know now that sedentary sitting isn't necessarily good. We want us to be active. We need to kind of do the combination of both. So it's walk more, sit less, and exercise. So they've got this triangle here where try to avoid taking less than 5,000 steps a day. So they've put it into a measure that most people can access for free. There's lots of different ways to measure activity, but most people have a step counter on their phone, and most people, not everyone, but most people do have a mobile phone these days, not all. But you can get little pedometers. There's ways to count your steps, or you might just have a certain distance that you walk every day, and you kind of know what that distance is, and you can do that. So try to avoid doing less than 5,000 steps a day and limit the prolonged sitting bouts. And then they've set the exercise into accumulating accumulate greater than 3,000 steps a day, with walking and other things. Now, some people say, well, I thought it was 10,000 steps a day. Well, that number is sort of arbitrary, so you don't have to meet 10. If you were doing 1,000 and now you're doing 5,000, that's brilliant. You've increased it five times. That's great. So don't minimize that. So you put it on the scale that works for you. And then the walking more adds in the extra steps a day, just doing any kind of walking. Doesn't necessarily have to be a set exercise bout. So you can see that combination is sort of around the 10,000 steps a day-ish mark, but it's breaking it up into a message that says you can get some of this by sitting less, you can get some by just kind of walking around, and you can also get some within your exercise. So again, it sort of starts to become a multi-component approach. So what's the bottom line? Do any amount of exercise or physical activity is better than doing nothing. That's the bottom line. Try to frequently break up your sitting time, your sedentary behaviors with moving of any kind. And engage in diverse types of activity, both physically and socially, because that's highly beneficial. And that is my message for the physical activity portion. We're going to do questions and answers at the end, so I'll move on to diet. But if you had any questions or things you were thinking, please jot them down, and then we can address those as we get to the end, yeah? Good. Okay, so what about our diet? What about nutrition as we get older? Well, I'll start with some of the things. I always like to have a hopeful message because there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of positivity. But I do like to point out some of the things that do happen, that change as we get older. They don't necessarily happen to all of us, or we don't necessarily have all of them happen to all of us, but they are things to be aware of and think about because they are changes that do impact what we can eat and how we eat. And then, of course, that affects our nutritional status, which in turn affects how well we move, which, of course, affects our health. So here's a circle of things that change as we get older. Our sensory perception declines, and I'll describe each of these in more detail in a moment on a bigger slide so you can see them. But our senses can dull or sharpen, depending. We get changes in both our mouth and our intestines. So there's a lot of changes there that impact on what we can eat and how we metabolize and store food. There's changes in our body composition, which is the balance between our body fat and our muscle mass and our bone. There's a reduced function of some of our organs. There is social isolation that can happen for a number of people. And of course, we just talked about the activity. Overall, when you look at population-based data, older adults are the least active segment of societies in Western societies. Does anybody know what country where the older adults are more active than everybody else? I'm hearing some China, but Taiwan, I think, is where we've got the data from mostly. But yeah, so kind of in Taiwan, they've got some data that shows the older adults are the most active segment of society, because even the young children are studying quite seriously, and they're inside and they're studying and they're sort of, very much valuing that academic experience. So it doesn't have to be the way it is now. We've gotten to this place, but we can always change it, can't we? So let me talk about each of these in a little more detail. So in changes in perception, our sense of smell and taste and vision decline. So these are linked with appetite, because eating is a multisensory experience. Eating food is not just a way to say, oh, well, I had to do it because I need the nutrients, or it's required. I wish I could just take a pill and make it simpler. There's a lot more value to eating than that. And if people aren't enjoying it, it's good to explore why that might be. But we do know we get reductions. We don't smell as well. We can't taste as acutely. And of course, we have changes in vision. What implications does this have for us? Well, it reduces our enjoyment of food. So that's why a lot of people don't want to really eat much anymore, because they don't really enjoy food very much. It doesn't taste good, or it's difficult to chew, which we'll talk about our mouth in a minute. But also it limits our food preferences and choices. So it starts to change. I don't know about you, but I used to love sweet things, and now I couldn't care less, although I did eat that biscuit, no problem. But my preference is now savory, where for years I just wanted to eat, that's it. Yeah, it was an oat biscuit. It was really nice. But I still eat sweets, but not to the level that I used to crave them. And now I crave cheese, and things like that. So I don't know that it's any better for me, but also it increases our risk of food infection or food poisoning, because we can't smell or taste if something's off. So that's why it's really important to read the labels and know those dates. However, we can't read the labels because it's hard to see them. So, it's like, how much more magnification I'm the same. I'm like, I can't even read this label. So that's a problem, but still you want to pay attention to those use-by dates in particular. Because I know, and the thing is, we also want to save money. You don't want to throw out good food. And sometimes it is safe to eat something even a couple days after that date. But because you trust your smell and your taste to tell you if it's wrong or off, it doesn't happen that way as we get older very effectively. And also, a lot of people can't drive as they get older, so it limits their ability to shop. And they may not be able to prepare food the way they used to, so all of that can impact on us. Also, it's hard to read not just labels, but knobs and controls and all that stuff when we're cooking. So if it's not at the right temperature, that causes problems, not just with taste, but is the food safe to eat, or is it burnt? Then you throw it out because you can't eat it, and you're like, whatever. So those are some of the things that happen there. Now, our mouth and intestines also change a bit. We can't produce as much saliva, and so that reduces our ability to chew things effectively, to swallow, and of course, taste it. Not having enough saliva changes our taste perceptions too. So those all combine. We also secrete less hydrochloric acid in our stomach. Our stomach's like a bag just with got lots of acid in there, and it's brilliant. But it's protected properly. If we're healthy, it's protected properly with layers of tissue, or mucus actually, that make sure that we don't burn the inside of our stomach. But what happens as we get older, you get reflux a bit because that sphincter between your stomach and your esophagus gets loose, so that acid starts to rise a little bit. That can be a problem. But also, we don't produce enough of the acid. And if we don't produce enough of the acid in our stomach, we can't metabolize and absorb certain key nutrients that need that acid to be released. So particularly vitamin B12 is a nutrient that's older adults are commonly deficient. Many people need B12 shots because they need a shot because they can't consume it because they don't have enough acid in the gut or the stomach to absorb it, to break it up and get it moving to where it needs to go. So that basically can happen. They've estimated about a third of the population might have challenges with acid levels in the stomach. So, and then we also have throughout our gut, particularly our lower intestine, our colon, these protective bacteria. Don't go and get a colon cleanse. It's the worst thing you can do. If you have it booked in this afternoon, cancel it. Don't do it. Not just that it's a little uncomfortable, but you don't want to be flushing out the bacteria in your gut. It's there for a really, really good reason. That's what we're calling our microbiota. You might have heard those terms now. Microflora, microbiota. It's this jungle. It's this amazing, crazy place where fantastic millions of bacteria are there, and they do really, really good things, not just for digesting food and other things, but now we're linking it with lots of other levels of health and ill health. So you don't want to clear that out. That's when you take antibiotics, you might get diarrhea, and then you struggle a bit. You take antibiotics, but then it kind of cleanses you out a bit, and then you've got to build those bacteria back up. So to protect our immune function and lots of other things, we want to try to optimize the good bacteria in our gut. What happens to our body? Well, we all know that because we're experiencing it as we sit here. Our body fat gets higher, our muscle mass declines, which means we lose muscle strength and it reduces our, physical function levels. Our abdominal fat shifts from being more at the subcutaneous level, kind of on the surface, to now, it's almost like it hides, it dives deep, and it goes around all the organs. So it becomes visceral, what we call it visceral. It surrounds our organs, and this increases risks of different metabolic diseases, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and the like. So not only do we become more obese as we get older, typically, we get more body fat anyway, but also that fat shifts to different places, and it's metabolically active in a different way, which isn't as beneficial for our health. Also, our bone density declines, which I think everybody knows about. And physical activity is so critical in not only building our bone mass when we're young, but trying to sustain as much of our bone mass as we can as we get older. Humans their peak bone mass, the highest our bone mass will ever be is in our early 20s. So if you didn't build it when you're young, then when you start to lose it, you start to lose even more. Men have usually higher bone density than women. There's hormonal reasons for that because boys can build more bone and denser bone than women, but on average. But still, men also lose bone, but they lose it more slowly and they have more to begin with. So that's why women tend to be more at risk for osteoporosis than men, but men can still get osteoporosis as well. So these things do happen, but what's one thing that we can do to try to reduce these changes? A lot of these are preventable. What could we do? There you go, be physically active right there. Moderates some of this. It doesn't completely obliterate all of it, but it definitely doesn't have to sound so negative or even be that way. What about our organs? Our kidneys cannot concentrate as much waste products, which increases our risk for dehydration. And what do we all do? Because we have to run to the loo every 5 minutes and we're tired of it. We intentionally dehydrate. I need to make it that trip. I don't want to have to stop, and find a place to go. So I'm just not going to drink any water most of the day. And so that compounds that already. So that's a problem. Our liver is less able to break down drugs and alcohol. Our liver is the machine that breaks everything down. Pretty much everything's passing through our liver at some point. And it clears out the drugs and the alcohol, whether they be prescription drugs or other drugs, but also alcohol. And so it's less able to do that. And our pancreas, which is the organ where we produce the insulin, is less precise. It has a harder time regulating blood glucose. And again, that increases our risk for diabetes. So bladder control, I love it. They say it may decline. I'm like, yeah, it does. I think a young person probably wrote that article, actually. They've not been there. So anyway, social isolation. We hear a lot about it in the news. Some of you may have experienced it yourselves. You know people who experience it. It seems to be getting worse, but now they're talking about social isolation in young people as well. So there maybe is something about our society where people are either feeling isolated or truly are isolated and they're not getting out and about or getting as much interaction. But we know we see this quite a bit in older adults. We know it increases risk for depression. I mentioned earlier, people just don't feel like eating and they don't really want to prepare meals because to them maybe they were used to preparing for a family or a partner and those people aren't there now. Also, when you're alone and socially isolated, you may have financial difficulties. You might be very limited in your income and you can't afford to access adequate amounts of healthy food. Also, some people don't have anyone looking out for them, and that's really important. So we don't ever know what's going to happen in our future. And I'll be honest, I've lived alone for a very long time and I love it. But I like to cook for myself and I make nice meals all the time. I freeze things, I like to exercise. So to me, being alone has never been an issue. I'm not going to be socially isolated because I choose to live alone. I could become socially isolated if I got sick or injured and I couldn't leave my house and no one came to see me. Then I'd go from this happy single living alone person to maybe somebody who was sad and felt socially isolated. Bizarrely, within the same sort of structure, my perception would change from that one thing. So those are some things that change. So we have a few modifications to what we recommend for the diet for older adults. So it's pretty much similar to what you've probably already heard. But I think it's important to recognize, I think one of the biggest things we worry about with older adults is frailty and being underweight. And this is a significant problem in older adults who are in clinical settings or care settings. That's really, really important. But in what we call free living, community dwelling older adults, about 70% are overweight or obese. And only about 3% are underweight. So I'm not saying we minimize people who are underweight or frail at all. We don't. But we also have to remember that we've got the majority of older adults who are a bit overweight or possibly even within what we call the obese category by body mass index. So we want to think about that in the round. And the recommendations I'm going to share with you now are for relatively healthy, community-dwelling, free-living older adults. It's not for people with medical conditions who are on special diets. It's not for people in a clinical setting or someone in a care home, just to make sure that's clear. So if you really want to get kind of more up-to-date, decent, fairly easy to decipher information on nutrition and food and what we should be eating, these are the sorts of sources to go to. It's so easy now to find things on the internet or in other places, popular books, and oh, they're exciting and they're so interesting. And they're really good at taking science that is real and then they twist it in a bizarre way to meet a certain approach that they feel we should take. So when anyone comes to me and says, I'm on this lemon-only diet and it's brilliant, and I'm like, well, good for it. And they're like, what do you think? I think it's crap. I don't think you should be on a lemon-only diet. And then they get all mad at me. Well, it's working for me. I'm like, brilliant. If you want to go for that lemon-only diet, go for it. But I'm thinking, why did you ask my opinion? Because you really don't want to know. So these are the sorts of places you can go for information, and they keep things up to date. But also, we do have individual preferences, and we have things we like. We also may choose to eat a certain way, and it does work for us, and we're healthy and we're fully functional. Brilliant. I don't judge anyone's, day-to-day eating behaviors or diets, not at all, because I don't like them judging mine. But some important points to think about is our energy balance. Because we're trying to sustain what I would call a healthy weight, and I would argue, I'm more of the proponent that says a bit of weight on us when we're older is a good thing. So I don't believe we should all be striving to be thin, unless you're naturally thin and that's your genetics and it works, and that's how your body is. But I've done a lot of diet and physical activity studies with older adults in my career, and we've been able to get them to lose weight without losing any muscle mass. They've lost fat and no muscle mass and or bone, and that's brilliant. But it takes, 3 days a week of an hour of aerobic, 2 days a week of weights. You can do it, but you have to be really focused on really sustaining the muscle mass and some of the other things, and keeping the diet, even though it's lower calorie, it's very high quality. So we can do those things, but studies have shown that as you get older, even being in the overweight category can be beneficial to health, as long as it's not to the point where it's causing you to be at risk for diabetes and things of that nature. So there's still a lot of argument. I don't think we'll ever be able to answer it fully, because each of us also has different levels of risk at the same kind of level of weight based on our genetic heritage. So just because you and I might weigh the same, it doesn't mean we have the same risk, because we've got lots of other things that go on. But energy, for the most part, we're trying to balance how much we consume with how much we expend to try to maintain a relatively healthy weight, and that's one where we can be active, where we can live a good social life, where we're relatively healthy, that type of thing. That's how I would define it. We still want everyone to eat a wide variety of foods. We still want people to try to balance that energy. And older adults tend to limit a lot of things in their diet. So sometimes when I do talk with older adults and they ask things, I just said, make that plate as colorful as you can and really try new things, try different things. I know maybe things don't taste as well as they used to, so try other things. Maybe your old favorites you're not crazy about, try some other things. And then, of course, people are less active, so we're always encouraging people to be more active to try to expend more energy. So that message isn't that much different from younger people. But we do need more vitamin D as we get older. And it's recommended to take a supplement, about 400 IUs a day, which is equivalent to 10 micrograms, whichever units you might be looking at. Now, there's very, very few food sources of vitamin D. Fatty, oily fish, which most people don't like to eat in large enough amounts to get their omega-3 fatty acids and their vitamin D. Also, there are breakfast cereals. Some breakfast cereals are fortified, as are some like soy beverages and things like that. So there are some foods that have been fortified with it. But we've got two issues going on here. Not only as we get older do we absorb less vitamin D in our skin, because that's how we convert it. And we get it when the sun hits our skin, those rays work within tissues within the skin, and it helps start that conversion process of inactive forms of vitamin D to active forms. So first of all, we're panicked about skin cancer, so we cover ourselves in sun cream for good reason. But that means we're completely blocking any ability to get any vitamin D. Second, we live in the UK. It is not the Sunshine State, or the Golden State for that matter. It is maybe 6 months a year we get enough of the rays of sun at a strong enough level between either March, April-ish and September, October-ish to actually convert vitamin D. But if we don't ever go out and our skin is never exposed to the sun at all, then we don't convert. And it is a fat-soluble vitamin. We can store it for a while, but we've got to have it getting to us in some way. So they are recommending now supplementation. And I'm not a dietitian, so I don't give you direct advice personally. If you want more information and you're not sure, definitely talk to your GP, or if you can get access to a dietitian or somebody who works with clients, that would be helpful information to get. But that's what they recommend now. Protein. Protein's always a big one. Young people are convinced there's not enough protein and they can't eat enough, and they want to be big, muscular-y and 6-pack, 8-pack, 12-pack, whatever they're trying to achieve, and they've got to do more protein. In a Western society like this, as long as we eat a wide variety of foods, protein doesn't tend to be an issue. Now, the current recommendation for older adults in the UK is 0.75 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And I'll show you a chart in a minute on converting that if you've got stones or whatever, your weight might be. So that's the current recommendation. However, there is a lot of evidence showing that maybe older adults might need as much as 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And more evidence is growing. And there's also evidence that active people need a bit more. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we're slow to change guidelines because we like to stick with what we feel safe with. 0.75 has been a safe number for a long time. But I think there's enough evidence building. Maybe in the next 10 years, we might see a shift in the recommendation for older adults. What does that look like? So depending on how you define your weight, whether it be in kilograms or I put weight in stones and pounds here, because I don't know if that would be useful to some of you, but you can do the math, so I'll let you do that. So if you weigh, for instance, 70 kilos, which is about 11 stone, to reach the lower recommendation, or the current recommendation, which is the lower level that we've got here, you'd need 53 grams of protein a day. But let's say you go, no, I think I want to go with the higher number. I think I like Janice, I like that recommendation she made. I think I'm going to go for the 84. Okay, now you might be saying, what does that mean? Like, what's 2 grams, what does that mean? So this next slide shows you what foods and about how much protein they have in them. So if you ate a chicken breast, and that chicken breast isn't very big, it's about 100 grams, it's about the size of my little fist, and I'm a small woman. That chicken breast would give you 32 grams of protein. You only need 53 at the low end, and 84 at the high end. So that so if you ate a big chicken breast, that would be almost 2 times. You'd almost be up to not quite to the higher level. But if you ate a gammon steak, it's 24, a cod fillet, 18, mince burger, again, and these are small. 100 grams is not very much. So when you actually eat what people serve you, or maybe what you make at home, it would be quite a bit bigger. You also can get milk from, of course, protein from the dairy products, milk, whole skimmed, and you don't lose your protein content when you take out the fat. They're removing the fat, they're not removing the protein. You actually have slightly higher protein content in the lower fat milks. And then, of course, yogurts and cheeses. But you can also get, the key for older adults, and well, everybody really, is the quality of the protein. So you don't have to be a meat eater. You don't have to consume dairy to get quality protein, but then you have to learn how to, what we call mutually supplement, do mutual supplementation with different sorts of vegetable sources together, not always in the same meal, but over the course of the day, because combining those creates a situation where you have complete proteins, not just all in one food, but it might be through the combinations of those foods, you get all the amino acids that you need, so it would be similar in quality to if you did eat meat or dairy. So you can do this as a vegetarian or a vegan. You just have to be very conscientious, and you have to really think about how much you're eating, what you're eating, and the timing in terms of the total day. But other than that, it's the same old story. And people hate this story because they think it's boring. Like, it's so boring. You just tell us to eat healthy and, eat a wide variety of foods and have lots of color on your plate. Yes. And I'm saying it again. It's not magical. It's not one food. It's not dingo gojolobi berries. It's not, blueberries. It's not kale. Are those things good? Yeah, they're brilliant. But those things are not what's going to reverse aging. There's no such thing as reversing aging. You stop aging because you die, but you don't, that's it. The reversal isn't happening, at least not on the inside. Now, people are doing it on the outside, but they look, that's up to them. So it's the same old story. Wide variety of foods, like I said. The 5-a-day message is good, although probably 7 would be better. But most people can't do the 5, so I say, hey, go for what you can achieve, you know? I'll shoot low for you, that's okay. And also, try to not have them all be fruit. Fruit's so nice, isn't it? Yeah. But if it's 5, try to do 3 veggie and 2 fruits. You know, if it's 7, try to have, 4 or 5 veggies and, and they're not huge portions. 80 grams is not a huge amount. It's a small kind of handful of some, a medium size, apple or something like that. It's not a huge amount. So if you ate a big giant bowl of vegetable soup that you made, you're probably, getting close to at least 3 a day right there for your vegetables. Less saturated fat and less added sugar. There's natural sugars in fruit, that's fine, but it's the added sugars. And we still are arguing about saturated fat. Now we're hearing maybe it's not so bad, maybe it's fine, maybe it's good. I think there's probably differences between the types of saturated fat, because fatty acids are like people. There's lots of different kinds, and they don't all have the same characteristics. So just because they call it saturated fat doesn't mean it's identical to everything. So probably the saturated fat in red meats and maybe pork and things is probably different. We know it's different, and the human body probably responds to it differently than, say, saturated fat in dairy products, because there's been some evidence that maybe the fat in dairy products isn't that harmful. But when it comes in meat, there's some other issues. So again, it doesn't mean you can't eat those things, but it's about moderation, balancing things out. And really, I think the added sugar is it's added calories that have no nutrients we don't need, and it just does a number on your teeth for sure. So, and it's, we want to keep our original teeth for as long as we possibly can. So that's important. And again, try to eat amounts that support a healthy body weight and a regularly active life. And then there's guides. The Eat Well guide, it's everywhere. It's really nice if you happen to eat off a plate. And I don't mean that jokingly, because a lot of cultures don't eat from plates. I work with a lot of people, and they make big pots of things, and people pull from those pots. They eat collectively. And so some people say, that doesn't work for me because I don't put it on a plate. So then I work with people to think about it in a different way, about how they do it. But this is a guide, and it's helpful to kind of show you the balance on that plate of about how much should be from the breads and the grains. And the breads and the grains, again, should be as much wholemeal as you can. You've got your little dairy slice, the blues there. You've got the greens, which is really the fruit and veg. And then you've got a pink, that's the protein types foods, beans, pulses, eggs, and just little tiny bits like out here on the outside, or a little bit of the sweet treats and crisps, and then of course water, a little bit of the oils and spreads and that type of thing. So it's the message you've all heard, but it's available graphically. You can look at it. It's available online if you want to learn more. The NHS has done a nice job of actually getting deep. You can, if you're really into these things, you can go in and figure out what are what are serving sizes, portion sizes, what are the different, ranges of things. And they have lots of other tools as well if anyone's interested. So that's an overall discussion about diet. And then I want to kind of close things out talking about the UK Diabetes and Diet Questionnaire. Do you all have that? No. Where is that? I know I sent it, and I believe they photocopied it. It's on the welcome table. Welcome to my UK Diabetes and Diet Questionnaire. So what we're going to do then, since you don't have it sitting right in front of you, I'm going to task you with a little homework. So when we're done here, I'll tell you a little bit about it, and I'll go through, why we developed it and how it might pertain to you, even though you think it might not. And so what you can do then is when we're all done and we do our Q&A and you've done all your other stuff, and on our break, maybe you want to pick it up, because you might want to fill it out yourself. You might want to share it with somebody you know. It is available in the public domain, which I'll talk about in a moment. So this is an example of what we call a food frequency questionnaire. So you don't have to write down everything you've eaten for the last, X number of days. It basically is some research I did with a PhD student of mine. In fact, it was her PhD, so she did, a lot of work. And we wanted to develop something that was UK-based, and we wanted something focused on the foods and the eating behaviors that we could show or illustrate are linked with diabetes risk, either lower risk or maybe poor glucose control in people who have diabetes. So we wanted it to be evidence-based and not just be a few questions about fruit and veg, because they're important, but we really wanted it to be scientifically linked. So we did a big systematic review. We searched the whole world, the whole literature base, in English anyway, around the world, and we found that there were no questionnaires of this type that were none from the UK. There were a few diet questionnaires in the UK, but not specific for diabetes and food. And also, the questionnaires that kind of had some bits were from other countries. And when you're looking at food and diet, you can't just use somebody else's questionnaire from a different country, because we do eat really differently and we have different types of foods, and we're impacted differently by the foods we eat and the cultures we live in. So like I said, I did this. It was a great 3 or so years with who's now Dr. Claire England. She's at the University of Bristol. And we did the original work and tested it with people who are either at risk, so they had established risk for diabetes, what we call pre-diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance, and also people we had work. She had been working on a trial, randomized control trial with patients with diabetes, newly diagnosed. So we had access to lots of people, either at risk or with diabetes, and we did lots of measures of their diet. We had them actually weigh and measure everything they ate for 4 days, and then we also tested out our tool. Now, this tool was developed not just by us, but we did an early stage where we asked lots of experts, dietitians, GPs, patients themselves, a range of people to say if we were trying to get something down to about 20 or so questions, because that would be considered brief in our world. If we wanted to do this, so we started out with like 50 questions, and we tried to get rounds of people helping us whittle this down. And we also then looked at the evidence. We had people's diets, we had this questionnaire, and then we had their metabolic health. We had all the numbers in front of us to say which foods and behaviors are more closely associated with certain types of eating or certain kinds of foods. And we could look at their blood sugar and things like that. And then we also included things from the literature. We know from research what kinds of things seem to be associated with either higher or lower diabetes risk. So we pulled it all together, and we developed this questionnaire, which you'll get to see once you are able to pick it up. We are pleased that we tested it, and it needs to be two things. It needs to be reliable, meaning that if you filled it out, and even though diet changes every day, but if you filled it out and then you filled it out again, within about a week, it should be somewhat similar unless you've intentionally changed your diet. But if you're eating fairly regularly, it should be reliable that way. This is very reliable. It's about 91% of a score of reliability, which is really quite high. And then the other one is it needs to be valid. How well does it compare to those 4-day weighed and measured food records that we had them do? In humans, because a food frequency is really, really a different animal from a 4-day food record, they're quite different. If you can get an agreement of about 50 to 60%, that would be considered quite strong and valid. We were able to do that. We were about 0.55 was the correlation that we had. So again, that's just as good, if not better, than most of the tools that are out there in other areas. So we felt strongly, and now we've expanded it, and we've been utilizing it across really diverse groups around the UK, across Birmingham, with lots of different groups. And we're finding that people can use it. They find it very useful, and it can be used across a lot of different cultures. And we're always making minor tweaks to maybe how it looks and things like that. But why would I bring this up here? It's not a diabetes conference, and a lot of you may not have diabetes or you feel you're not at risk. But I show you this graph to indicate diabetes and its risk. Before I do this, it's hard for me to see with these lights. Show of hands, who thinks that their risk of diabetes is pretty close to zero, that you really feel you don't have much risk at all? Okay, that's quite a few of you. Who think you have kind of a moderate risk maybe? Okay, good, all right. There's actually no such thing as zero risk of diabetes. I'm sorry. It doesn't mean you're going to get it. That's not what I'm saying. It means that we all have the potential risk, but of course, again, we've got genetic heritage, we've got lifestyle factors, we've got even individualized responses to food and environment that we're just starting to finally explore a bit to try to understand that alters our risk, either higher or lower. Even people at high risk many times don't get it. Even though they've got the genetic heritage and other things, they don't get it. So it's not that it's guaranteed one way or the other. But when we say people are at low risk, that means you're at low risk. It means you have less of the risk factors, or very few of them. You're active, you're at a healthy weight, you're eating properly. That's all really, really good. And that's what I do, even though my dad had type 2 diabetes, so I'm a double the risk because of a direct, relative who had it. But my hope is that I won't get it. And I've got siblings who don't do anything, and they're quite overweight, and they don't have diabetes either, so I don't know. But I like exercising and eating well, so there you go. But this graph shows you, the reason I bring up diabetes a lot, and the reason I study it and I work with people, is that if you look at diabetes, which is the left, the dark blue bar on the very left of each of these years, so these are years going from 2009 up through about 2014, so it's every couple years, and it was, it's projecting or looking at where we think diabetes projection's gonna go based on these numbers here. And then the light blue, which is the second bar in, is cancer, all forms of cancer. So if you look in 2009-10, we had over 5% of the population with diabetes and about just over 1% of the population with cancers. And then if you look at 2013-14, it's actually, if I look at the number now, it's gone even higher. So this is an older projection. I think our current numbers are, 7 or 8%? Maybe it's 6.5. But that projection is going steadily, not just as predicted, but maybe even sharper. And cancers are rising a bit, but not near as much, and it's still relatively low percentage-wise for the population. That doesn't mean cancers aren't important. That doesn't mean we shouldn't treat them, fight them, do everything we can to either not have it or survive it. So I'm not minimizing any disease over another. I bring up diabetes, though, because of its prevalence and how widespread. They're predicting that by the year 2050, at least half of the UK population will have diabetes, type 2. And a lot of that is because of our obesity levels and our lack of activity. And we're also living longer, and our pancreas doesn't function as well as we get older, so that's another compounder, that adds to that risk. So I don't want to depress and leave it negative in any way, shape, or form, because the good thing about type 2 diabetes is it's preventable. Or even if you have it, it's manageable. And that's what's really helpful, because there are some conditions that we get or diagnosed with that we don't have as much control over what we can do. With type 2 diabetes, we have a lot of control over what we can do, both for prevention and also for management. So I share this tool because some people just like to have a diet tool and they like to see, how well they're eating. It's fairly straightforward to fill out, pretty quick and easy. Most people 10 or 15 minutes to read through it. People can self-administer, they can fill it out with somebody else. But as I mentioned, there's really no such thing as zero risk for diabetes. We all have different relative risks, but we can all do something about that and do lots of things, which I already talked about today, through the diet, through the physical activity, to reduce that risk. And these are the sorts of things, I guess, which I tapped upon. So it's really just a reminder, an overview of, we can't make our pancreas any more functional as we get older. We don't have a magic pill or surgery to make our pancreas more functional as we get older, but we can try to sustain a healthier weight. Even if we're a bit overweight, we can stay active, or try to be as active as possible, and that makes a difference. And so give it a go. When you get a chance, try it. You might think, but my sister would love this or my friend would love this. That's fine. And it's really quick and easy to score, you'll see. It's got photos of food to help you with portions, because it'll ask you about how many portions a week you might eat, and you're like, I'm not sure. So it tries to give you a guide for some of that. It also has some additional questions that don't get scored, additional things about behaviors you might want to think about. There's a few little statements in there that help with goal setting. And so in a sense, it can give you, without having a dietitian on the other side of you, some thought and reflection on how you might want to improve the quality of your diet and your eating behaviors, or maybe you're already doing a great job and that just reassures you that you can sustain those behaviors. So that is really the bulk. That's my presentation, but I know now we've got a period for question and answer, so I didn't know, are you going to be calling on people or? Okay,
yes,
brilliant.
We'll do the answering.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can we have some lights, please?
And also, as a reminder, they're going to bring around a microphone. If you do want to ask a question, they're going to bring around a microphone. Please wait till you get the microphone before you ask the question, because they are recording us. So if you just ask your question without the mic, they can't hear you, I can't hear you, and then they get upset with me up there. So don't let that happen. So
right.
yeah, speak into the microphone so we can hear you.
Right, any hands up? One in the front here.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. In your physical activity and mortality risk, at the very last line, it says, the last chart, it says VIG 2 times X weeks, and it shows you have a higher. Why? What is that?
Good question. That's for the vigorous. Those were for people who did vigorous activity at least 2 times a week. That bar looks a little bit higher. It was not considered statistically so or necessarily even that reliable a result because there were very few older people in that sample who were doing more than 2 times a week vigorous physical activity. So of course we have to report it because it's data. People have to report their data. But the authors did make it clear that that doesn't actually indicate a true increased risk. If we had a higher sample, then we'd have confidence, or that number might be very different. It probably, it could flatten out. Maybe it does. Maybe it goes down a bit. We don't know. But there weren't enough people to make any confidence with that statement. Yep.
Thank you very much. Is there a chance I can ask another question?
I think it's...
Go on.
The second question is about the walking activities, so many steps. Does it matter how fast you do walk or not?
No, it's about moving. And so, of course, if you walk faster, you get more steps in a shorter period of time as well. So, but the bottom line, it is around how somebody chooses to walk and what works for them. Because we all have a self-selected pace. Our self-selected pace does tend to slow a bit as we get older. But again, it's also very individualized. But no, it's basically just the message is more of the steps. And the intensity, it's nice to get a little bit higher. And so if you can walk a little bit faster for some of it and get your heart rate up and breathe a little bit more for part of it, great. But that doesn't have to be the whole thing. So it's probably just a mixture. But it is really just moving and stepping.
Thank you very much.
Somebody there?
Some of this sounds quite sort of doom and gloom. We'll go away and we'll think we can't eat chocolate anymore, and we have to run.
Now, wait a minute. Did I say that?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Just saying, we'll
She's
think
got
that.
a biscuit.
I just ate my biscuit. Come on now.
Excellent. I hope it was a chocolate biscuit. And we have to do exercise we don't necessarily want to do. What I wanted to add to the mix was sex. Because there is, I'm serious, there is evidence that sexual activity, vigorous sexual activity, dare I say, is actually very good for you in terms of the amount of oxygen that you use, and it's also quite a good social activity. I'm only saying that because...
Especially if it's more than 2 people.
Yeah. I'm saying that because what you say about staying at the conference.
Actually, you're right. There's a lot of evidence. There's not a large body of evidence about the energy expenditure. So I wouldn't get caught up in that because everybody has sex differently, more vigorously or less vigorously. But no, definitely, sex has been identified as really important all throughout life. And it also should be enjoyable. It's important socially, it's important physically, it's important emotionally. There's a lot of benefits, physiological benefits as well. So that I would consider that as part of your physical activity
3 times a week.
You don't have to. There's no step counting. You don't have to worry about that. So. That's fine. But to be honest, I didn't mean it to be really doom and gloom. I was hoping to be more positive, and I feel kind of guilty. But no, actually, that's why I use the word physical activity predominantly, because this isn't about exercise per se. It's not about a separate exercise session. When people say they don't want to be active, and I said, do you really want to sit all day in a chair being strapped down for 15 hours? And they're like, well, no. I said, well, then you want to be active. If you just want to move, that's all we're talking about. And the movement I mentioned here is really achievable. If you walked 10 or 15 minutes to the bus stop, and you did that back and forth during a day, that's well over 5,000 steps right there. So it isn't, if you actually do stuff and you start to kind of look at it, it really isn't huge amounts of stuff. And that is, you're right, the key is doing stuff you enjoy that you're going to want to do. And that's why the multi-component stuff is good, because it opens up the door to do lots of different kinds of things in different ways. So you don't have to have a set pattern unless a set pattern works for you. Some people like to do the same thing every day because they enjoy it. I do lots of different things on different days, because that's what works for me. And that's why the wide variety of diet, we still included the sugars and the sweets and stuff. It was just, I didn't say you couldn't, the recommendation is try to eat less of them, but it's just, if people tell me, I'm gonna die one day, and I don't wanna die not having had cheese or a piece of chocolate, and those are decisions I make, but what I don't do is eat a chocolate bar every single day. But, everybody's different, and maybe that's your treat, and that's brilliant, but I do eat biscuits every day.
Somebody up there?
Lyndall Bond, Chesterfield, U3A. I just wondered if we can get your guide, the UK DDQ. Can we get this digitally?
Actually, we don't have, sadly, we didn't have the money to actually get it to where you could complete it online, but you can access it and pull it off and print it and use a paper copy, but we don't have it linked with a database or anything like that, because the funding that we got from the government only funded Claire enough to develop it and to get the actual questionnaire ready that is available. But it's actually always stored on the University of Bristol. In fact, if you just type in UK DDQ University Bristol, it should pop up, and you can actually, because it's open access for anyone to look at. You just have to print it out to fill it out. There's not an electronic means to do that. We'd like to get to that point. We're still trying to get funding to do that. So that's hopefully in the future. Thank you.
Lady there.
Joan Miller from Radlett U3A. You have a study on mortality risk. Do you have one on quality of life, or does anyone else?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is a body of literature looking at quality of life, defined in lots of different ways. They do have quantitative surveys that they use for quality of life in a lot of medical type studies. And then there's also a lot where they look at psychological health, risk of depression and things of that nature. So there's quite a wide range of what we might call quality of life measures. And in the overwhelming evidence is that for people who are more physically active, they do report, and these are always self-reported, so it's always someone's perception. No one's judging them. Their perception of their health is better. It's much higher and healthier if they're active both physically and socially, or socially. So social activity is really critical. So there's that engagement. It also tends to be higher in people with healthier diets, but people with healthier diets tend to have less disease or disease risk, which means you'd have a higher self-reported quality of life. But they do go together. So you probably couldn't separate out specifically what's really contributing. It's probably a big picture of all those things coming together to optimize quality of life. Yeah.
Any more? I can shout. No, we've got somebody up there.
We have, there you go. Go ahead. The mic there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Ruth. I'm from Wearside U3A. I just wanted to make a comment, actually, rather than a question, on the doom and gloom thing. I didn't find it that at all.
Oh, good.
I found, actually, that it was positive and achievable things that were given to us, and not in the slightest bit preaching at us. So thank you.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. And also, just to say, it's also okay, if you felt it was a bit doom and gloom, that's okay too, because we're all individuals, and we all get triggered by different things, so no worries.
Hello, thank you. Stan Moore from Wrexham, near Chester. I always have to add that.
Help me with my geography.
I think the health of the country would improve quite a lot if a lot of us took this talk and gave it to our U3As. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, the Eat Well guide, I've never seen that.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh, wow.
Number of times I've been sitting in the surgery or one of the 4 waiting rooms in the surgery. Now that should be plastered on every wall, and lots of other information. And I wonder how much of this is in medical education. How many doctors are tuned in? I'm sure I'm treading on a lot of toes here now.
No, it's okay. I think, medical schools, they're all different, so I won't comment on the curriculum in every medical school. But in general, both in the UK and in the US, where I'm from, there is no nutrition education at all in medical degrees. Now some of them have changed, so some of them are starting to incorporate that. And until recently, fairly recently, there wasn't much on physical activity or exercise. However, that one has really taken off. Nottingham Medical School actually delivers and has very specific education now on exercise and physical activity as one example. I think others are doing the same. There have been courses developed for medical schools and medics to get educated. Now, a lot of medics are interested in this personally or for their clients or patients, so they also then learn many times in addition. And once they're trained, they also then will get additional training in various ways. I give a lot of talks to medical groups as well. But of course, they're a real diverse body, and they have all different backgrounds. So I would say, could more be done in medical schools? Definitely. I don't have power over setting any medical curriculum, and all the medical curricula are really, really super full. And even I'm at Birmingham, and I'm really good friends with my medical colleagues and the people who set the curriculum. We've met and talked. We've just beat our head against the wall to figure out how could we get some more of this stuff in there. And it's so full already, it's really sometimes difficult. But I think maybe the answer isn't in just trying to shove it into an already too busy medical curriculum. Maybe there's other ways we go about medical training. And nurses get a bit more than medical doctors do. But still, there's probably more there. But I think I like your idea about maybe we all spread the word. I have a PhD in exercise physiology and nutrition. I'm not a dietitian, though. I don't work with direct one-to-one clients, but I do research on nutrition. And so for me, the fact that you could go to back to your surgery, GP surgery, and just request that they put up Eat Well plates because they're there and they have free, it's not only just online, but they'll send, public health England, anybody will send you this stuff. It's all there. It's available for free or virtually nothing for GP surgery. So it's kind of locally what people choose to highlight and what they want to put up on their walls. But those are messages. And also, if anything in my slides are useful, use it. Please do. This, even though, and I've quoted the science, if it's not mine, you've got it there. So if you just are sharing a message, we don't copyright messages. We copyright
graphs. Having a copy of your... A digital copy of your talk.
A digital copy. I don't see any. I'm thinking. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be. Everything, like I said, everything that's not mine, I believe I put a reference on. So I wasn't taking for credit for something that wasn't mine. No. I'll go back and double check that. But once I've done that, I'll check the images to make sure there's nothing that I've been naughty about using that I shouldn't have. I do that sometimes.
Before we have any more questions, can you make sure, please, you give your name and your U3A? And those who've already asked questions and not done so, it's my fault for not reminding you. Could you possibly just see Francis Beckett, who I believe is down there, I can't see him, or wherever he is, just to give him your name and U3A if you've already asked a question. That would be very helpful. So from now on, name and U3A, please. Somebody there?
Is this on now? Yes. Joy Wingfield, West Bridgeford, U3A. In a previous life, I was a pharmacist, and I find now that all my U3A colleagues ask me questions which they don't seem to want to ask the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
The specific one is always about statins. Mm-hmm. And recently, although I'm retired, obviously, I still read lots of stuff. Mm-hmm. And there was some very compelling research, meta-studies and so forth, which was suggesting that when we're looking at Q risk, the risk of getting a heart attack in a certain number of years, etc., much more significant was this insulin resistance within the pancreas than the levels of cholesterol. Mm-hmm. And certainly for people who haven't yet had a heart attack, I have tended to say, you'd be better off changing your lifestyle than risking the statins. Mm-hmm. I think I've probably got the answer. In other words, there is nothing in the pipeline that might address the decrease in pancreatic activity that you're aware of. It is simply that you've got to address it through lifestyle changes. to minimise the risk of diabetes?
I think the actual age-related decline, that maybe might be more of a natural decline just with aging, there's probably nothing we can do. But part of the complexity is that as we're getting older, we're also fatiguing our pancreas, particularly if we are insulin resistant, because that pancreas is having to work overtime all the time to create more insulin so that we can then be sensitive enough to it. Do you see what I mean? So that's why the lifestyle, particularly the exercise, or physical activity, I should say, not exercise, but movement is so important. Muscle contractions, so skeletal muscle contraction of any kind, has an insulin-like effect without having insulin present. Yes, so that's why movement is so important to reduce diabetes risk, whether it's you're really preventive, you're not even close to having it, or if you're already starting to have some resistance. That resistance is happening in the peripheral cells. It's happening in our fat cells and things like that. So by moving our muscles, we're actually able to get the glucose into the cell much more readily even without insulin. And that's quite important, and then it reduces the burden on the pancreas, over time. So there are things, even with the prevention lifestyle that we do, which could help probably reduce some of that pancreatic fatigue. There's probably some with age, but maybe not as much as we're seeing.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just switch on again? Just to say that pharmacy training does include nutritional advice. We are encouraged to get the public to talk to pharmacists about dietary advice, because we do actually do quite a lot of study.
And I echo that for sure. In fact, the pharmacists are the people want to come to now and talk to them. They can access pharmacists, and the pharmacists, the ones that I've worked with in the medical school in Birmingham that I give lectures to, they do have a really diverse knowledge base and skill set, definitely. Yeah.
Hooray.
Right, yes.
Krista Lloyd, Wearside U3A. My question is about vitamin D. You were saying, and on the slide, you were indicating that just having vitamin D in the diet is not necessarily sufficient because we have to convert it. I have been advised to take a vitamin D supplement. The week after I was advised to take a vitamin D supplement, there was an article in the Which Association magazine which basically stated that vitamin D was about the only vitamin supplement that there was sufficient clinical evidence to prove that older people should be taking it. The next day, the price of vitamin D supplements almost doubled.
Of course it did.
And in Boots, the vitamin D on its own vanished off the shelves, and there were only the combination vitamin supplements available. The price has not come down. It is continuing to increase, and I think that this is absolutely wrong, and that if we are expected to fund our own supplements, which is an indication that the NHS is encouraging people to buy their own supplements where they are available readily, that this should be protected, that the vitamin D should be on its own and kept at an affordable price. Thank you.
I agree. Very good. And to clarify the point you made, actually, it wasn't about absorbing or the converting it. We can convert it. It's harder to convert when we're older. But the diet itself has very few sources, and it's really small amounts. So it's a bit of both. So we've got kind of the double whammy there. Yeah, exactly. But you're right. The minute we find out something works, if somebody can increase the price, they'll do it. Sadly.
Right, just two more questions, I think, because Janice needs a break, and I know people will come and talk to her when we finish, so she needs her coffee too, I think. Is coffee all right?
Tea. I'm a tea person.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Black, no amount of sugar.
Shri Sharma, South Solihull's U3A. Can I ask you about the pancreas issue? Professor Taylor at Newcastle University recently published a study, I gather, suggesting that fat loss over an extended period of time freed the pancreas of surrounding fat and so reactivated it. Is this also is this part of your understanding too, that it would alleviate diabetes, type 2 diabetes?
Yes. Yeah, I don't do that specific research myself, so I'm not. But I do know that research. It's very high quality research. It's very reputable and valid research. And so yes, so that would be not only, I mentioned before about movement of the muscles and how it has an insulin-like effect, so we reduce, in a sense, the load on the pancreas. The same with the fat around it, because also it's our fat cells that become really insensitive to insulin. So it's not only the physical, I think, load around the pancreas itself because of the visceral, that centralized fat, but then it's also how we metabolically process things because of all the fat, or fail to. So yeah, that would be along very similar lines.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Done. Mike Hollingsworth, Bramhall, U3A, Stockport. You gave the message about the achievability of behavioural change. If you take a large population of moderately overweight older people, which is easier to achieve? Increase in physical activity or alteration of diet? Are there studies with evidence?
No, there's no. Well, I've done plenty of interventions like you mentioned, but we didn't actually try to tease out one or the other because both are quite important to health, and because I do both, studies either study nutrition or they study physical activity, but a lot of times they don't either put them together or put them in the same study. Does that make sense? But I can try. I hate to generalize and stereotype, so please forgive me. But there is some evidence from the weight loss literature, so this would be the wider weight loss literature, in terms of ways people prefer to lose weight. So that's the literature I can go on with you. I don't have a study that's done the same study and compared them in older adults. But across the lifespan, when you look at weight loss studies in adults, the more preferred way to lose weight in studies with women is diet. And the more preferred way in studies with men is exercise. Now, I hate to say that because I know plenty of men who hate to exercise, and I know plenty of women who love to exercise, and vice versa. But there still seems to be some indication of that. And I don't know, we've not studied why that might be the case, or what is it about, maybe it's the messaging and the way we work with people about how to lose weight or how to do other things. There might be a socialization around it. But I also find in humans, this is not just men, men or women. Humans tend to want to punish themselves, and we're bad and we're terrible, so we want to do something extreme, not only to get the quick thing, but because we're bad and we need to be mean to ourselves. And I think that's where like the really reduced diets and all that kind of stuff, or the really extreme exercise, people go there because it's almost like a penance, because they're a bad, sinful person because they've allowed themselves to get fat. And I think that's where that attitude about overweight and obesity isn't helpful to anybody, because it's not, we don't choose to be overweight and obese. We don't choose to have diabetes. People say, oh, it's all within our control. Some of it is and some of it's not. We don't all start from the same level playing field. We don't all have the same income. We don't all have the same culture or social connections. There's now evidence that we have a genetic tendency to be active or not, or a genetic tendency to choose healthier foods or not. So there is probably even a genetic component. Doesn't mean we give up all control and say it's not my fault, but at the same time, I don't like to point at individuals and say, if individuals would just change, the whole world would change. Because we're swimming upstream. We're those salmon that's struggling because there's crap food everywhere, and it's impossible to be active, and there's all kinds of things working against us, and then we're expected to somehow overcome that like that. So I don't know if that's helpful in any way, but yeah.
Very last one.
Hi, David Clark, Canterbury U3A. Your talk's been fantastic. Thank you for offering to make the electronic version of it available to us, albeit edited.
Yeah.
That's great. I also see we've videoed it, and I do hope we can take that video, because it just won't be as good if one of us does it instead of you, so we can show the whole thing.
Thank you.
So actually with that, I don't really need to say thank you, do you? You've done it for me. But I think we probably know most of these things. They're in the back of our mind somewhere, but I think it's great to be reminded. And I am saying to myself, right, I'm going to have more time now because I'm going to finish as chairman, so I must take the dog out more often. I must go a bit further. I must eat less. Sorry. So I think it's a very, very good reminder to us all. And again, like I say, go off and preach the gospel. Please do that in your U3As or in your families or wherever. So Janice, thank you so much. Lovely delivery. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
You must be ready for a cup of tea.